everyone. Good evening. Thank you all for coming tonight. My name is Colin, and the topic for tonight is Gnosticism. So my talk, the plan that I have, I at first was going to do a PowerPoint, and then my ADHD and my laziness kicked in. I ended up not making one. So you'll have to stare at me, and I may do some jigs or dances throughout the lecture to keep things entertaining. But the past few classes that I've done here at Blazing Star Oasis, I really don't want to just stand here and just talk. So what I like to do is allow people almost like a symposium or more dialogical, so that if you have thoughts or you would like to chime in about something, please feel free to do that. You won't be distracting me, and I don't mind it. In fact, I encourage it. So I'm very happy to be doing this particular talk. Gnosticism is something that I've been aware of personally since I was an adolescent, because my mother, besides having sort of what you might call traditional religious texts floating around in our apartment, I remember encountering like the Gospel of Thomas and Gospel of Mary Magdalene when I was like 11 or 12 and being like, wait, there's more than just the four that I've been told about. And I remember, I don't know if you're all familiar with the Da Vinci Code, but that I think was the first time that Gnosticism really got a broad audience in terms of people not even being aware that, again, there were these additional Christian documents. And I was pretty aware of the Da Vinci Code and was kind of caught up in that discussion around, you know, what happened with Jesus, did he have children, and what's the deal with these alternative scriptures? I find it fascinating because most of what we know as, I guess, people living in this country being exposed, at least culturally, to Christianity, is we sort of have the narrative of Jesus, or the narrative of Orthodox Christianity, pretty ingrained in our minds, whether we have at one point identified with the Christian tradition, or if we are still wrestling with it, or have completely rejected it. The idea that the narrative contained in the four Gospels being the only version of events, when I talk to folks about the subject, that's pretty much an assumption that's made. And what I like about the Gnostic texts in particular is that they challenge the Orthodox narrative in ways that are surprising. For an example, women get a lot more of a say in the Gnostic tradition than in the Orthodox tradition. Sexuality and even gender fluidity is very much present in the Nag Hammadi text, something that is rather absent in more mainline traditional texts. So I always say that the Gnostic myths or stories sometimes are very charged. They could be seen as being offensive, and it's no wonder that there were persecutions and censorship of the text. So what I'd like to do in this talk is start with, what do we know about the Gnostics? Who were they? How do we even begin to frame a historical narrative of these folks that were around, starting around arguably the 3rd century to the 4th century being the real big time for their development. Then I want to talk about some of the text, and I've brought a few books with me, and I'll just read some passages. I will summarize some documents, talk about the really juicy, really offensive stuff. I'll be mentioning that a few times because, again, we're in heresy territory here from a historical point of view, okay? So, and I love reveling in the idea that we're going to unlock some of these things and talk about things that probably scared ancient Orthodox Christians. And then the third part of the talk, why does it even matter? What is it about Gnosticism that still reverberates in the 21st century? And I'll mention some obvious things about connections to Thelema, drag in some Carl Jung as well, because everywhere I go, I like to do that. And then also talk about mainstream culture, some movies perhaps that we might be familiar with that have some Gnostic themes. So prior to coming here tonight, how many of you are somewhat familiar with Gnostic text or Gnosticism in general? Okay, cool. All right, so everybody in the room, awesome. All right, you can help me out then. So, like I said, how do we know much about the Gnostics? What is it? What historical data are we dealing with? Well, It's difficult really to answer that question because the vast majority of the earliest extant information that we have on the Gnostics goes back to the early church fathers that were criticizing them. So what we know around the formation of the early church fathers and also the early Orthodox Church, and we'll say Nicaea 325 and then onward, you have a number of early church fathers that are writing against emerging heresies. And it's unhelpful that the early church fathers were inconsistent in how they categorized these different groups. At times they would just say, oh, well, they're all Gnostic. And then sometimes they would get into real nitty-gritty specifics on what they were talking about. But there are some common themes of the accusations against them. One, that the Gnostics preferred to have a direct experience with the divine, as opposed to saying that it had to be this mediation between Christ in the Orthodox sense of the phrase. That you could have direct gnosis or illumination, and that was the path to enlightenment and to salvation. And so it really brought the spiritual process away from a hierarchy to something that was available to each individual person. Now, having said that, you can see in the New Testament evidence to suggest that as early as Paul, one can make the argument that direct gnosis began with Paul. And in fact, in some of the Gnostic texts, Paul is actually somebody who they are cool with. There's a revelation of Paul in the Nag Hammadi library, and where Paul is depicted as being the first person to say, well, I had this really crazy encounter on the road to Damascus, and I don't need anybody else to tell me about anything because I've had this illuminated experience. But Paul is also cited by these early church fathers to subsequently condemn the Gnostics as well. And so direct illumination without a human teacher, gnosis, is the first thing they're charged with in terms of heresy. Allowing women to have positions of power in the early communities, that was a big no-no. Also, their openness and their willingness to have sexuality and gender be a big part of their community conversation and spirituality. And we know more from the early church fathers who were condemning some of the Gnostic groups. They were accused of having this strange initiatic ritual called the bridal chamber, and where you would bring in, usually it was, the church fathers would say, a man and a woman, and that they would go into a secret chamber, and it was pretty obvious that the illusion was that some sort of sexual spirituality or sex magic, something was happening there in the bridal chamber, and then they would leave the bridal chamber transformed. Looking at some of the Gnostic texts, it's difficult to say whether this was meant to be a psychological or a spiritual union, or whether they actually did go in and physically do these things. But that was a real big no-no, obviously, was to have such forms of initiation occurring. But really around the time of these early church fathers, you have historical Gnostics that are leaving behind writings, and they are producing their own documents. And for the longest time, I mean, really not until 1798, when the first independent Gnostic codex was discovered. Up until that point, we were really dealing with, again, these quotes from the early church fathers that would say, oh, well, they have this gospel called the Gospel of Judas, and they would quote some lines. So it was a combination of either hearsay, some claim to have some direct communication with some of these early groups in terms of their practices, and then claims that they were quoting some of these texts. That's some of the earliest data that we have, and really for scholarship, until the late 18th century, that was it. Then around 1798, we have two major codices that are found that contain the Pista Sophia, which is one of the largest Gnostic texts that's completely extant. And that was one of the earliest times where scholars were able to actually look at the texts and then compare them to what the early church fathers were saying. what's interesting is that some of the texts that were found in these early codices were not directly mentioned by the early church fathers. The only exception to that is the Gospel of Mary Magdalene. And so even though we had these fragments of information on the Gnostics, still the overwhelming data was from the early church fathers, who obviously had a bias against them. Now, thinking about historical criticism, there is something to be said about people who are criticizing others, because you can assume that they're going to exaggerate things or misconstrue things, but there may actually be elements of truth in the critique. If you think about how offensive some of these ideas may be to the early church fathers, you could assume that maybe there are elements of truth. And later on, when we find more documents, we find that actually some of the things that they were complaining about were actually accurate. Some of the early church fathers that we are aware of, some of the early Gnostic bishops that we are aware of, Valentinus being one in particular, wasn't really considered that radical at the beginning of his career. So what we find is that we have early Christians of authority, and Valentinus, I believe, almost became Bishop of Rome at one point in his career. He was up to be voted on being the Bishop of Rome, meaning the Pope. Okay, so at one point we were that close to Orthodox Christianity going in a really different direction, potentially. But I mentioned Valentinus for a couple of reasons. One, because he's in the EGC's Communion of Saints. In fact, in the O.T.O. we have, I believe, 3 Gnostic saints that are historical Gnostic figures. And Valentinus is important because he was blending in with the Orthodox community of his time. So he began this process of still going to church on Sunday, still doing what might be considered normal, typical, conventional, early Christian practices. But we have evidence to suggest that he did begin this notion of, we have this public church community, but then there's this secret initiatic group beneath the surface that really not everyone's going to participate in for one reason or another. And this idea of having this larger objective kind of public community and then sort of like this elite, more esoteric dimension going on, that starts really with Valentinus. And we have some fragments of particular prayers and evidence of words for special forms of additional baptisms and things that were not meant for public consumption, but were meant to initiate people into these mysteries and aid them with the illumination or with gnosis. So Valentinus was pretty close to becoming Pope, but he didn't make the cut. And after he failed that, he had that experience in his career, he was subsequently shunned, like some of these other really popular names, shunned and not excommunicated, but really, told to basically get out of town, essentially. So we do have evidence of these great thinkers that are, again, trying to blend in with the early Orthodox community. And then after the Council of Nicaea, where Christianity, at least at that point, 325, makes some pretty heavy agreements around the nature of Christ and the Trinity, suddenly we start having narratives of very distinct Gnostic groups beyond Valentinus. So I think some of the early church fathers, there may have been some tolerance of the Valentinian Gnostics. Well, then we start getting groups that are considered way, way out there by Orthodox Christianity. So we have this up to this point after 325 where things start getting really interesting. And then we have these official canonized lists of what the New Testament is going to be. And after a while, the circulation of these texts, if there was huge circulation, seems to go away. And as I mentioned, so we have 1798, Pisa Sophia. There's still this gap in knowledge, and it's not until the 1940s, 1946, that we discover the Nag Hammadi scriptures. The Nag Hammadi is in Egypt. This is an interesting story. There was a Bedouin shepherd who was out with his flock, and he was walking along some ruins of a particular area, and I think literally he stuck his foot in it. I mean, he was walking and, whoa, what is this? And looks down, and underneath there are these jars, these clay jars. And when he brought them out, he saw that they were papyri, they were in Coptic, some fragments of Greek, so scholars are certain that there were Greek originals copied into Coptic. And then there is sort of like this James Bond narrative of like, okay, well, he thought to himself, maybe I could sell these off, sell them to different groups. And so it took a while for scholars to go, no, this is all this one collection here, and actually bring them back together and begin to analyze them. In between 1798 to 1946, scholarship really was, again, there was this void of knowledge. We had so many texts that were being quoted that had not been discovered yet. And so it's pretty miraculous that we even had thinkers like Carl Jung, Blavatsky, G.R.S. Mead, who they were trying to reconstruct the Gnostics from just these fragments. Fast forward to 1946, we have this whole library, and now we can see texts. Again, a lot of it is missing because of age and things like this, but looking through the Nag Hammadi texts, we have full extant Gospels like the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Judas, Gospel of Thomas, and these were texts that were only quoted by church fathers, but now we actually have access to them. So what are some of the things that they say? Well, the Gospel of Thomas is one in particular that I'll start with. It's probably the most popular, I would say, in terms of public consumption because it's so familiar to people who read Christian scripture or Judeo-Christian Islamic scripture. The Gospel of Thomas acts as a dialogue between Jesus Christ and his disciples, and it's like a Q&A session. The disciple asks a question, and Christ responds. But the sayings and some of the parables and some of the direct quotes overlap with Matthew and Luke. Almost, they are verbatim. There are these overlap, these similarities in verses. But what's interesting in Thomas, there are particular ideas that are absent in Matthew and Luke. So for an example, a verse from Thomas, it says, if you split open if you cut down this tree, or you split open this vine, I will be there. Or if you discover the mysteries of these words, you will achieve illumination, okay? That you yourself can become as enlightened as Christ. You can drink from the water that I am drinking from. These are things that he mentions in Thomas, and these are noticeably absent from, as I say, Matthew and Luke, even though there's tons of parallel and verbatim quotations. Some biblical historians think that there's this hypothetical Q document that was a collection of sayings that then were dispersed and finally written down to these other documents. There's no concrete evidence for that. We're talking about probability. What's the probability of some of these independent collections or narratives having overlapping sayings? Were they all pulling from one source and deciding what to select or not? Or is it just coincidence? Or people just sitting around sharing stories? We don't really know. Until we build a time machine, maybe then we'll know. And I'm sure that's the first thing we'll do is go back and answer this question if we build a time machine. But what I find interesting is where the Gnostics deviate from the established narrative. So the Gospel of Thomas isn't really that shocking. And when you look at even contemporary 21st century fundamentalist thinkers who are very, very vocal anti-Gnostic, the Gospel of Thomas sometimes just kind of gets a pass. It's like, yeah, it's okay. There's some verses that we don't really agree with, but overall it's okay. Well, that was one gospel that was found in Nag Hammadi, fully extant. The Gospel of Philip is where things get really interesting, because the Gospel of Philip is a document mentioned by name in the Da Vinci Code, movie and book. But the Gospel of Philip, again, is more of a lecture from Jesus, or more of a dialogue at times. But this is where it gets really interesting, because the Gospel of Philip now starts playing with gender and sex. and women's position in the church community. Androgyny is mentioned over and over again. The idea that there is a state of being where gender is questionable, that they're blended together. They're mentioning of males transforming into females, females transforming into males, that at some point that process of transformation can occur. And again, the bridal chamber, this infamous bridal chamber that the early church fathers were saying, yeah, this is a practice that these Gnostics do, the bridal chamber is mentioned explicitly in the Gospel of Philip. And it really does say that you will bring these two into this chamber and there will be this initiatic experience that has to do with sex. And they are transformed as a result. So these are the shocking things that the early church fathers were really afraid of and concerned about. Besides having these unique practices that are outside the orbit of traditional or Orthodox Christianity, another thing that the Gnostics do is, again, they kind of flip the narrative on their head. Judas, for an example, in the Gospel of Judas, is seen as a hero figure as opposed to the person who is the traitor or the betrayer. In the New Testament documents, Judas is possessed by Satan, and according to the Gospel of John, Satan enters him. It's John or Luke, one of those. It mentions that explicitly, but that Judas is the betrayer, and there's really not a lot of narrative detail about why. Why did Judas decide to betray Jesus? It's kind of left up to the imagination, except for one of the Gospels that says that Satan entered him, and I guess that's the motivation. Gospel of Judas is interesting because Judas is taken aside by Jesus, and Jesus says, look, it's all part of the plan, okay? And actually, they're going to hate you, but for this whole drama to come to this conclusion, I actually need someone to betray me. It's just the way the story has to go. And Judas, of course, is horrified by this, but he does fulfill his duty, and then from the perspective right near the end of the gospel, it does say, all the disciples hated him and, turned on him, but he was just doing his job. So it really does play with the narrative, like I said, in this way, but there is this anxiety about knowledge because throughout most of the Gnostic texts, anytime Jesus, this is a common theme, Jesus taking aside like one person or two people and saying, I have the secret stuff to tell you, okay? So here we have what I would argue is the Gnostics with their structure. Again, you have the kind of public church community and then the esoteric initiatic order underneath the surface. You see that being played out in their own gospel narratives or texts where, it's like, Jesus is publicly talking about these things, but then secretly taking people over and going, this is actually the real good stuff right here that I have to tell you. And then the disciple who's hearing these things is anxious going, but if I start talking about these things, people are going to really hate me, because this is going so against what has come before, the public things you're telling me and these secrets. It's almost too much. So you have that theme throughout the Gospels, these Gnostic Gospels in particular. Another real big difference between Gnosticism and Orthodox Christianity is the question of evil. And we could be here all night talking about philosophically, like, why is there evil? And it'd be probably interesting to get all of our individual opinions about, like, what is evil and why. But the Gnostics had a really interesting opinion about this. They looked at their earlier scripture, the Hebrew scripture, and saw verses that really disturbed them. And this is not unusual. Marcion, who was an early church father, was one of the first early Christians to say, let's just drop kick the Old Testament. We don't really need that. And let's just have one gospel. We'll keep Paul's epistles and we'll just, throw out everything else. Well, this is interesting because this has been a debate amongst early Christians in terms of what do you do with reconciling this glaring difference between a very angry, wrathful God in the Old Testament versus a God of a loving Father as represented in the New Testament. The Gnostics read the Old Testament and thought, well, that probably is some sort of divinity that's being a total jerk. But it's not the highest God, the all, the one, the unknowable. It's this false God, this divinity that through either a mistake in birth, and there's all these different versions of this myth, by the way. He's a celestial aborted fetus. He is a celestial, whoops, I didn't mean to get pregnant with that. Or Sophia, the divinity of wisdom, thinks that she can, in the celestial Pomora, or what is what it's called, the fullness, the celestial everything, that she thinks she can break away and create things on her own, and because of her presumption, being presumptuous, that creates this false deity. But in any event, there is this demiurge that is considered to be selfish, proclaiming there is no other God but me, and trying to order people around. And that is why there is this, if not evil, this is the Gnostic explanation for why humans were just not great sometimes. That was their attempt to try to explain this. So that there's a part of our character makeup, part of our psyche that tends towards these very selfish, not very loving, compassion goes out the window. So then how do we get out of this funk? How are we liberated from this funk? And that is the difference in the role that Christ plays in the Gnostic tradition as opposed to what we're familiar, I would say, with the majority of Orthodox Christian views. There's really not this emphasis on there's this thing called original sin, or that Christ needs to die for the sins of humanity. Really, Christ is seen as a liberator, someone who's coming in and going, you're stuck in the matrix, and we need to get you out of the matrix. We need to enlighten you and illuminate you. So really more of a psychological liberator as opposed to a savior, even though he's referred to as savior in many of the Gnostic texts. But you can see actually evidence in the text where like an earlier Gnostic text is devoid of Christian terminology. And then there's a second version that's written, and then all the Christian terminology is inserted in. That's an interesting thing to notice from a textual point of view, because then it's like, well, wait, are they trying to catch more Christian readers with the same ideas? Is it easier for someone being introduced to Gnostic ideas, maybe from the more public church community? Is it easier for them to accept if it's in their religious terminology? Probably, I would say. But it's interesting to see those different versions, the evolution of some of these ideas. But in a cosmic way, the idea is that some mistake happened which made this celestial tyrant, the celestial dictator, in charge of the physical world. And that there needs to be messengers that come through to kind of wake people up. And it's not just Jesus. Many of the Gnostics, or people who inherited the Gnostic tradition, like Mani in particular from Menantianism, they inherited this Gnostic tradition and went in their own unique direction. But then there's these messengers of light. People are coming through to wake people up, to expand people's consciousness. And a lot of it has to do with the personification of Sophia as a feminine principle, as at times seen as the daughter of wisdom or the mother, and that she incarnates. And in fact, there are texts that suggest that Sophia has a human representation, and there are hints of that in the Gospel of Mary Magdalene, where when you have Christ as the Logos incarnated, you must have Sophia incarnated, and these two together, the masculine and the feminine, are part of the enlightening process for people. So the Gospel of Mary Magdalene is a trippy gospel. We're missing huge chunks of it, unfortunately. It starts like in mid-sentence, is the first verse that we have. But what it does is it makes Mary Magdalene the central character in the narrative. Christ has already left the scene. He's gone to wherever he's gone to. The disciples are just kind of hanging out, telling stories about him. And one of them asks, "Oh, hey, Mary, he told you some stuff, right? You know, one day. And she goes, yeah. And then what she starts revealing to the other disciples is like what might be considered an ancient acid trip. It's like going through these various levels of heavenly reality, going through like all 8 of them in this ascent, this psychological ascent. And she describes them in detail, what she was exposed to, and then even says that you yourself can go through this ascent, this expansion of consciousness. And it's interesting because it's Peter who at the end goes, are we really going to listen to this? She's a woman, for crying out loud. And the other disciples go, well, wait a minute. If the teacher gave her this dynamite information, then it shouldn't matter whether she's a woman or not. You know, she's imparting this information to us. And then they go about their business, and that's how the gospel really ends. But again, you have that anxiety around, like, I have this information, but it's also a comment on whether women could be teachers to men in the ancient period. I'm going to pause there for a second and just see if there's any thoughts or questions at this point. So I feel like I've blasted a lot of things at all of you. Yes?
I'm wondering if you've ever seen the film Stigmata.
I have. Yes. And the Gospel of Thomas, I think, is mentioned in that.
Yeah.
Yes. Did you want to say more about it, or?
Oh, I just wondered if you were familiar with it, because I was thinking about it.
Yeah.
I love it. I think it's a great.
It is.
Yeah.
Have others seen Stigmata?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I had thought about that earlier. I can't remember the last time I saw that movie, but I do remember that it is the Gospel of Thomas spoiler alert, it's the Gospel of Thomas, that's the secret document that is discovered and revealed in the movie. It's a great film.
Yeah, don't they show there's like a passage at the show in the end of the movie, and it's like, I'll be there underneath a rock or something like that.
Yes.
I remember seeing that as a kid with my very Catholic parents, and you know, feeling the light.
So you felt delight.
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, that's great. Yeah, it's go ahead. Yeah.
So you were mentioning that there were some of the early church leaders that were quoting bits of these texts. Is it believed that they had access to the actual text, or is it something that was kind of passed along? You know, quoting from person to person, and then at some point in time when they decided that these are apocryphal and we're not going to include them, that they just kind of mostly disappeared. How did certain quotes get brought forward if there's not the documents for them to quote from?
That's right. Yeah, it's a great question. So unfortunately, the academic standards of the early church fathers fall short to what we consider now to be cite your sources, right? Plagiarism. Really. From my recollection, I could be wrong about this. I mean, the main people we're talking about here, Irenaeus is one early church father in particular, writing against heresies. Hippolytus writing against heresies, and there's one other one. I'm blanking now. I'm going to be kind of looking at some of the fellow seminarians in the room, but they will not help me, I'm sure. But there's this third name that I'm blanking on. But you had these. Burl, are you thinking of?
Clement?
So I'm glad you mentioned Clement. That's not who I was thinking of, but we're gonna backtrack to Clement in a moment. So I appreciate that. Well, suffice to say, my recollection of many of the quotes, and I'm not going to stand here and say I've read all of the entire works of these early church fathers against heresies. There's only so much time in a 24-hour period, right? But my recollection of the quotes is usually as vague as this. Some of these Gnostics say the following. Quote, end quote. And they don't really say, it's because I have their gospel right here and I'm doing my homework. Sometimes the sentence is very vague. They claim they have a gospel attributed to Judas. And in this gospel, it has these ideas, right? We now that we actually have the documents, we can compare those. And again, we've actually can see that some of the things that the early church fathers were saying were in these texts, they were telling the truth. accurate information. Sometimes it's greatly exaggerated, but some of the Gnostic texts don't need the help of early church fathers' exaggeration. Some of it is really bizarre. And again, I will be quoting some of this stuff to you. I'll be reading some of these passages. But yeah, I don't recall any of the early church fathers saying, I actually have these things here. And I'm quoting them verbatim, to answer your question. Another thing that's strange is that the early church fathers are quoted as naming certain documents that we still have not found yet. Or perhaps did they make up the names? Possible. Even in the Gnostic texts themselves, they'll say, oh, for more information on what I'm talking about, see this text and this text. We don't have those either. So again, what other person walking through older parts of Egypt, all of Egypt is incredibly old, will accidentally stumble into something? Or is this similar to what we know was common during the ancient period, where you just make up the names of people who are writing things, or you just make up names of places, and maybe that's what it is? But it's this interesting kind of chase to discover which documents are genuine, what do they really say, and then for the ones that are quoted to us that we don't even have, or don't even have other corroboration, that's even weirder, right, in terms of a question mark. Any other,
Just, you were talking about how John and Paul are often like kind of this blending of the orthodoxy and the gnosis. And I'm just kind of wondering if like you could speak a little bit more to that, the forgeries of the letters of Paul or the book of Revelation, just as, kind of the consensus building of like bringing in enough of the Gnostics to not really cause a big fuss when you really crack down,
Yeah. Well, so that's the thing about Revelation is, it's an illuminating experience for John on the island of Patmos. And I mean, Revelation was hotly debated in the early Christian community in terms of whether it should be included in the canon or not. Even before Nicaea in particular, that was something that was debated. I do think even as later on, as Martin Luther even saying, like, do we really need this book of Revelation? Like, really? I mean, again, it's another celestial acid trip, but with interesting things going on in it. But people can't seem to get away from it because of the rich symbolism, and really thinking about the connection to Thelema in the book of Revelation, I guess, it's actually a good thing that we still have the text around. That wasn't lost in the sands of time. But with Paul, it's interesting because, again, Paul has this illuminating experience and then is describing how other people can have these illuminating experiences too. And I know that there are a few of his epistles that are considered to be, written by him, and others that are attributed to him, right, in the New Testament canon. I think the big difference between what we see in the New Testament for Paul and why it's not considered heretical, what he's talking about, is that there is this strong emphasis on the death and resurrection of Christ, right? So on one hand, you can have these amazing illuminating experiences, but there still is this huge emphasis on what I would say is the traditional Orthodox Christian point of view. And I think that's why it's fine. But I think it's also a reason why the early Gnostics were able to read Paul and go, well, he was on to something here. There's obviously didn't happen in a vacuum. This guy had an experience, and yeah, he may have interpreted it in his own way that maybe the Gnostics didn't totally agree with, but there was that common theme of that illuminating experience. So that's how I would try to answer the question. Yeah.
I just, two questions. One, what was the heyday of the Gnostics? When were they most around, I guess, or most of these texts produced? And like, what was the final cutoff? I think you said the Council of Nicaea, and then it started disappearing after that. And my other thing was, not all of them are Christian though, right?
Correct. Yes, thank you. So, two really good questions. So, it's hard to know exactly like when the Gnostic movement really begins. You know, this is another debate. You know, who influences who? When is a starting point? We know that the early Orthodox Christian material is around 50 CE. You know, 50 of the Common Era. Gospel of Mark is usually attributed to 70 CE with the sacking of Jerusalem by the Romans. So I would say around probably 100 CE up to the end of the 4th century is probably the time that was the glory days. Essentially, you had the most eclectic groups. You had more evidence of there being a whole variety of different Gnostic communities that had their own various versions of the mythology or of the teachings. And then again with Valentinus getting really popular and then falling out of favor, all of that is really happening before there's this huge establishment of orthodoxy in 325. They still persisted after that point, but you can see more evidence of them losing the debate and there being more of a suppression occurring. People translating the documents quickly into, again, from Greek to Coptic as a form of preservation. And then also we know that some of the documents got around the Mediterranean because these different codices were discovered in different places, right? And so we do know that. But it really, it's not that we lose the Gnostics, is that they are inherited by other groups. I mentioned Mani and Menantiism in particular. So that's, St. Augustine. So we're talking now, 4th, 5th, 6th century Menantianism. We also have the Cathar heresy in southern France. So that's the medieval period, right? And what these all have in common is they have very distinctive Gnostic features. Again, this duality of like the evil and the light, right? The darkness and the light. There being, now I'm thinking of Star Wars, sorry, I'm a nerd anyway. And also women having authority, additional baptisms. These are all the things the Cathars were doing and were then condemned for. So you do see these patterns of what makes a group Gnostic in its flavor. So I think at some point, obviously, when there was that crackdown on what is orthodoxy, I think the ideas were then passed, the torch was passed to these other groups, right? So that's how I would answer that question. Now, for your second question, yes, in the Nag Hammadi library, what's fascinating about whoever assembled this library, it's not just, as I say, Christian, strictly Christian or Christian-influenced documents. You have fragments of Plato's Republic in here. You have Hermetic texts, quotations from Hermetic text in here as well. And then you do have this interesting thing where you have some documents that aren't Christian, they're not Hermetic, they're something else, and then someone writes a second version, as I said, and then inserts explicitly Christian language into the narrative.
So you have something like that in there, where
Yes,
two versions.
that's right. That's right. And so that's an interesting thing, because then the origin of some of these ideas, it's still debatable, who originated some of these things. The idea of having this sort of arrogant idiot God that comes about in such a bizarre way, it's very unique, because it's not just someone reading the Old Testament going, God, Yahweh is just a prick, right? I mean, that may have been the launching point, but the way in which they construct the mythology of everything is very unique to the genre. And it's something that I can't seem to trace it to anything prior to these groups. So this is a really unique stamp for them. Did I see another? I think we're going to come back to some of the points you raised, but that's how I would answer that too. Yeah.
How was Gnosticism put into practice? Like, were there like specific churches? Did people practice solitary at home? How did that come about? Like a mixture of communities?
Yeah.
Practicing at home?
Yeah.
How was that?
I think it depends on the group and the time period. Certainly paralleling the early Christian communities, a lot of this happened in the home. because of fear of oppression or persecution. So if they were groups that were sort of parallel to the early Christians, it was very common to meet in the home. They didn't have their own place to organize. Then when Christianity becomes very popular and becomes a legal religion, and then we have a group, we have one group deciding what's true and what's heresy, then there is even more suppression going on. But like I said, with Valentinus being a good example, I don't know where they would go, but Valentinus, there seems to be with the Valentinian Christians that yes, they would go to the church on Sunday, and then the real fun stuff happened somewhere else, right? They weren't in the church of the common people. They were off somewhere doing these more initiatic type sacraments. And they really did, like the bridal chamber is called a sacrament in the Valentinian corpus. So they felt that the bridal chamber, while it was only permitted for a certain few to be initiated, was just as high as taking bread and wine as sacrament or baptism, right? It was an additional sacrament that was very important to them. In terms of some of the other
Was this performed at a certain age?
I don't know,
Okay.
and I don't think because I don't know. I'm not a Greek scholar or a Coptic scholar. I would imagine that Greek probably has words to denote a developmental stage. So when it says man and woman, I'm assuming that the Greek original probably would give you an idea. I'm assuming it's an adult, but again, I don't know. I wouldn't be able to answer that. I do know that there is emphasis in some of the Gnostic texts around running water or being close to live water. So a river or streams or even caves as well that have their own pool of water. And that's pretty traditional with the some of the groups that are still in Iraq right now that are part of the Gnostic heritage that derive their teachings from not only Gnosticism but John the Baptist, and routinely will go into living water or live water and will do ritual baptism there. The Mandeans is what I believe they're called. And they are also, excuse me, they're also heirs to the Gnostic tradition.
Is there any blend of Islam in with this? Like as far as that goes, like in Iraq?
I'm not sure if there's really a blend with the Mandeans and Islam, although the Quran mentions a particular group when it mentions people of the book that are outside of Islam. It mentions Jews, Christians, and then there's an Arabic word, Sabians. And I think some scholars think the Sabians is a reference to what we know as the Mandeans. So this group that has an allegiance to John the Baptist in terms of ritual baptism, but also has a huge smattering of Gnostic ideas in their theology. So I think they were really independent, and that's why even to this day they face persecution in southern Iraq because they did not integrate with the larger Iraqi community. But throughout Iraq's history, or what we call Iraq, they were tolerated as a group, as a monotheistic group. So I think it's a combination of, yes, some community forms of ritual or worship, but also individual contemplation. We get the sense in a lot of the Gnostic texts that you're encouraged to go and meditate on some of these words or these ideas. Some of the statements in the Gospel of Thomas are kind of almost like Zen koans. They're meant to really just kind of zap your consciousness, right? Hymns or prayers that you would really only recite one-on-one. So there is this combination of community and individual practice, which I think is something that the heirs of ancient Gnosticism have in common: community and individual practice. Burl, you have a question?
Well, yeah, this is a big jump, but I was just wondering if, sort of a list, of modern movements. I'm wondering if you, with your experience from Gnosticism, would say these are Gnostic movements. The Course in Miracles.
I would say, yeah, sure.
Christian Science.
I'm not, I don't know if I could say yes or no to that.
Just that, and because you know David Delancey?
I don't.
He has this thing, he says, and I have no idea if this is true, but he was a really brilliant scout who lives in Berkeley. And he says that the word Nazarene is not a Greek word for a person from Nazareth. It was a title that was given to Jesus, he said, only by the demons. And it was actually the name of the Mandean high priest. And his thesis is that Jesus was a spin-off from the Mandeans.
Nice.
And was a Nazarenos by virtue of that. And the specialty of these high priests was exorcism.
Thank you. I didn't know any of that.
Chunk.
Yeah. Well, I think having the emphasis on personal illumination outside of being told what to believe, I would say that some of the contemporary movements, you know, and obviously Thelema is in this category, you know, and both attaching to this historic lineage that we hear when we're in the Mass with the saints, but also this emphasis on having the communal aspect, and then the public aspect, and then there being the initiatic aspect and the individual practices. So there are these parallels there, right? In terms of there being acceptance of gender variation and sex being a perfectly okay topic of conversation and a part of spirituality. So definitely Thelema fits that bill. The Theosophical Society probably also fits that bill, mainly because Blavatsky and J.R.S. Mead, who was her assistant and secretary at one time and went on to become a great scholar. And again, one of the reasons why we even have a translation of the Pistis Sophia is because of J.R.S. Mead. He also wrote another book called Fragments of Gnosticism, where he pulled all of the then existing fragments from these other codices I mentioned, and all the quotations from all the early church fathers, and put them all in one book. I don't have that. I ordered it. It's probably in my P.O. box back home, but I don't have my copy with me of Fragments of Gnosticism, or Fragments of a Faith Forgotten, as I think the original title was. But Theosophy would also count, I would say, and Blavatsky certainly attached the then Theosophical Society under her leadership with the ancient Gnostics. So this idea that you feel that the world, at least that there's a lot of suffering and tragedy in the world, or that humans have a potential to rise above the material, sometimes very negative existence, and that through expansion of consciousness you can achieve illumination, that is certainly a Gnostic idea, most definitely. So I would say that any movement that feels that that's one of the central cores of their practice could really be considered contemporary Gnostics. Jungian psychology, of course. I brought my copy of the little baby red book here, and I brought it because this is, Jung, besides writing a very short version of what he calls the 7 Sermons to the Dead, he signs the author not as himself, but as the name that I can never pronounce, who's in our list. This is why I brought this as my cheat sheet here. He actually signs it with his name. Basilides. Am I pronouncing that correctly? Basilides, thank you. And that's the name that Jung signs as being the author of his 7 Sermons to the Dead, right? So he really put the Gnostic stamp on there. But what's important, and I guess this is a quick segue to talk about Jung in particular, Jung was living at a time when these early codices were discovered. And he, through J.R.S. Mead, he actually owned everything by J.R.S. Mead. They were in his library. This is how Jung was able to learn about the Gnostics, was following the scholarship of people like Blavatsky and J.R.S. Mead. And what Jung was able to do was look at the texts that he had access to at the time. And, he died in 1961. And he was struck by their take on the stories and their emphasis on gnosis. And he really theorized that the Gnostics were an ancient equivalent to what he was doing as a depth psychologist or an analytical psychologist. So he derived this theory that the Gnostics were creating or giving a written language to these spontaneous psychological experiences and they were trying to make sense of what was going on with them. And that these myths were meant to be an explanation of normal psychological changes that occur with people. So for example, Jung felt that the demiurge is the ego that gets, the part of ourselves that thinks I'm the best thing in the world. There is no other God but me, right? The very kind of arrogant part of our personality that really needs to be humbled, and maybe knocked on its butt a few times, right? And that having these things penetrate consciousness from this outside spiritual realm called the Plamora. For Jung, that was the collective unconscious. So the figure of Christ, the figure of Sophia, these other divinities, these archons, these other entities, these are archetypes, the things that erupt into consciousness and really challenge normal consciousness that is more self-centered. So for the Gnostics, it was an inward look, but it wasn't supposed to be a selfish self-centeredness. Really, you're supposed to be transformed in a positive way because of these experiences and encourage others to do this as well. So Jung was one of the, really is credited with taking the available information and giving a psychological commentary on their theology. And again, historically saying, what I'm trying to do as a 20th century psychologist or psychiatrist, that's what the Gnostics were basically doing in the ancient period. So I'll say that for Jung in particular. Any other questions or thoughts? Yes?
Since you brought up Jung, it's been a couple of years since I was reading through his works, but I remember him also talking about how the alchemists had taken on board Gnostic thinking, and how many of them had seemed even to be unaware that they had departed from Orthodox Christianity in their alchemical ideas.
Yes.
So they almost had like a split mind. Like on one hand, someone like Paracelsus would think of himself as a regular Christian.
That's right.
But on the other hand, he had all these ideas that were just like flat out Gnostic.
Yes, that's right. And exactly what you said is right on. If you look at, so Jung wrote three books. One is particularly large, but 3 books on the psychology of alchemy. That's one of the titles, but the 3 volumes in the collected works. And he does, in fact, make that historical argument that the alchemists were historical heirs to the Gnostics, and that, yes, they, on the surface, felt that, Paracelsus is a great example. Again, kind of like Valentinus before him, attending regular church, going and being a regular ordained priest and doing all the things you would expect a priest to do. But then he's talking about these alchemical changes that are occurring. And again, this idea that there is the base lead metal, this representation of the part of us that needs to be burned away and purified so that the illumination, the gold, can really shine through. I just jumped a number of the in-between stages, but that's essentially lead to gold. But it's, it is this process, and it's a recurring process. Because in the alchemical lab, the beakers, you see that it almost creates a circular motion, So it is not just this one-time experience. Swedenborg is another good example with regeneration, right? And so I don't know how many people would attach Gnosticism to Swedenborg, but again, this theme of being illuminated, and then encouraging others that, yes, you can also have this illuminated regenerative experience. Certainly, Swedenborg is in that category too. So you really do see folks who are at times maybe living double lives, like the alchemists, or a double mind, right, as you said. Yeah. Celeste.
It's driving me crazy, and I'm forgetting, are the Dead Sea Scrolls a Gnostic text or
Earlier. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but another major finding.
Yeah.
So the Dead Sea Scrolls were part of the Qumran community in Palestine. The Essenes is another group that's attributed to them. So there are some similarities, but the difference is that the Essenes who went out to Qumran, they for whatever reason decided they did not want to be part of the general temple worship in Jerusalem as part of Jewish practice. I think they felt that the temple hierarchy was corrupt, and they wanted to get away from all of that. So they went out into the desert, and Qumran is by the Dead Sea, but you're out there, you're far away from other people, and it's fascinating. They lived in these cave networks along the side of the elevated hills and mountains, and that's where these scrolls were discovered. They had a lot of similarities, though. They had ritualized bathing and baptism. They had their own particular texts that they created. And there is this huge emphasis on the brotherhood of light and the brotherhood of darkness. So again, there is like evil forces that are to be combated by those who have gone through initiations or rituals, that they are in a place to be able to fight against this darkness. But we know quite a bit about them now, and there's some historical theories to suggest that either Jesus hung out with them at one point, or even Jesus' brother, James, may have had some connection to them as well. So not Gnostic, or a alternative Jewish group is how I would say, but certainly fascinating find. Most definitely. And you can find the complete Dead Sea Scrolls. They've been translated and they are available. And for a working theory of like who were they, a really great book called James the Brother of Jesus by Robert Eisenman. If you want to read a book that's like that big as a paperback, seriously, you could hurt someone with just a paperback alone, I'm sure. It's fun. I mean, I've corresponded with this guy. He's a professor down in UC Santa Barbara. I don't really know if his theories are really that widely accepted, and honestly, you get kind of lost with a book that big and an editor who refused to tell him to shorten it. You get kind of lost in a lot of his references, but his main theory is that James, the brother of Jesus, was connected to the Qumran community, and that really changes the way we might look at early Christianity in particular. Yeah, to answer that question.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So another hand. I felt like there was
Question.
Yes.
So one of the things that I've always struggled with personally with Gnosticism is like on the one hand I really love all like the psychedelic and forms of exploring consciousness that you find in the Gnostics, but then on the other hand there does seem to often crop up this sort of life negating attitude, like this is a mistake and we've got to get the fuck out of here, right? And it almost sometimes feels a little like Heaven's Gate, right?
Yeah.
Like we've got to get in the spaceship and get off this rock. And so like on one hand I really drawn to the Gnostics, and then on the other hand sometimes just like no, that's not like that, like I can't like really get on board with that sort of worldview.
That's right.
But I also do know that there are different ways in which different groups of Gnostics relate to what they see as sort of the cosmic air, right? And so I just wonder if you could maybe address like some of those different takes on like what do you do once you realize that this universe was created by the demiurge and you're essentially stuck here, right? And until you find your way out.
Right. No, I really appreciate you mentioning that and not letting me get away with not addressing that. There is definitely evidence to suggest that there is a hostile view in a number of the documents, in Nag Hammadi in particular, that are flesh or bodily denial. It's and not just sexual union or marriage, but just like, the body is garbage and needs to be viewed as such. That the world, that this matter material is inherently evil because the demiurge was the instrument of creating our physical form, not our psychological essence, which is of the higher plamora. Or it originates there, but our physical, when the Hebrew scriptures say they made man, let's make man in our image, that interpretation is it's the demiurge saying, okay, we're gonna make this human like this. Interesting though, there are other Gnostic texts that say that there are different types of people in the material world. That there are some that were created by the demiurge, but there were others that were not created by the demiurge. Well, that gets kind of complicated because that creates sort of an us and them mentality, right? Like, so I'm of the group that was not touched by the demiurge, but then how do we figure out who was? So it does create that sort of division. Valentinus was of the opinion that not so much that the material world is garbage necessarily, but that there are these three mindsets that humans can adopt throughout their life. There's the one that's just focused on the material world, that is just interested in what are they doing with their material wealth or their power and things like this. And I will admit, Valentinus didn't really have a very optimistic view of his three categories. He really did think the vast majority of humans can't go beyond that base category. So looking at like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, they really only seem to care about like it's just the bottom, and even if they had a chance, we're not even talking about people who wouldn't even have the chance to aspire upward because of circumstances, but even if they could just sit on their butts all day long because they had so much money, they don't want to break the ceiling. They don't want to go above and beyond. The second category are folks that are very spiritual and are interested in some form of transformation, but they really just can't get beyond the confines of the dogmatic orthodoxy. And then there's the third, which are the Gnostics, right? They're the ones who have broken through, and they've experienced this major transformation. But unfortunately, yes, even a lot of the heirs to the Gnostics, Manny in particular, even the Cathars, there does seem to be this world-denying aspect. So now you've discovered that you're in the matrix, you have to get out, like you were saying. You have to hit the eject button. But and there's different variations even of that bleak attitude. Some want to encourage the reader to renounce what you're doing and just become some lonely hermit somewhere. But then there are others, like in the Matrix, where it's like, okay, not only do we get out, but we're going to try and liberate it. We're going to come back and try and change it, right? There's another version there that's also at play. So I would say it's actually a range. The range is like total denial, everything sucks, to like actually, yeah, things are tough, but there's enough tools here that we can do something about it, right? So I hope that kind of starts to answer the question. But it really, when you look at each individual Gnostic text, even when you're used to sort of some of the language or some of the ideas, I swear there's nuance in every single one. So just when you think you have a handle on the mythology or on the where you think this narrative is going, suddenly there's a curveball, and it makes the document itself very unique in its own right when comparing like one or two together. Yeah.
Just off of that, the Ellen Page has this great book, Gnostics, and she describes a community that rejected the world, had the consciousness that this is the evil creation, this hellish place that keeps us from God. And their response was, so no more babies, which is anal and blowjobs only. As like a way of like finding a compromise, of like, well, the body has needs, but to bring adult life into this hellish system is unconscionable. And then Origen being the famous example of hating this flesh so much that he circumcised or castrated himself with a rock.
With a rock.
No anesthetic. But he believed in the cosmic regeneration of the soul.
Yes, that's right.
And so it was the overcoming of the physical form in this lifetime. For him, anyway.
That's right. That's right. Thank you. There's a lot of great images there. That's not thank you for that. But no, it's true though. And that actually reminds me to jump off of what you just said back to Clement. That so some of these early, especially the Alexandrian early church fathers. This is another thing that I forgot to mention in the history is that even with the first century, with Hellenistic philosophy, with Greco and then Greco-Roman philosophy, Neoplatonism bleeding into the smorgasbord of ideas that was in the Mediterranean basin, but really in Palestine, you have that's a whole area where you have early church fathers that have these ideas that would be considered strange, like Origen having some of these ideas, or the radical notion that even God will forgive Satan by the end of this whole business. Shocking, I know, right? That everyone will just be forgiven. But no, we have to have that hellfire and brimstone. So Origen's idea is trashed. But this influence first of Hellenistic thought, then having this gap of time, and again having this really unique myth that's at play with the Gnostic text. But the Hellenistic culture definitely needs to be recognized, the Greeks and the Romans, and especially because Plato is so represented in the Nag Hammadi texts, whether it's indirect, vocabulary that's used in some of the other documents, or we have, there's fragments of the Republic in the Nag Hammadi text. So we can assume rightly that the Gnostics were reading Plato for sure, and probably getting some of those ideas mixed in with their existing ideas. So I appreciate that. Yeah.
I was wondering about a couple of things. There seems to be some stuff floating around the Gnosticism that came from the Persian Empire, like the Chaldean era oracles, about which I know nothing except that everybody back then seemed to respect them. And the Hymn of the Pearl.
Yes.
Can you say anything about the Hymn of the Pearl?
So the Hymn of the Pearl is interesting. This is, when you look at it from a textual point of view, the Hymn of the Pearl was, this was something that J.R.S. Mead was commenting on, because in one of the earlier codices from 1798, you had, and even about to the mid-1800s, you have one codex in particular, independent of another codex. One just has the hymn of the pearl, or to the pearl in it, but then you have another one that has all the other acts. So there's the Acts of the Apostles that's in the New Testament that says, okay, so after Jesus left the scene, this is what all the apostles went and did. And there's actually something, Keith's not here tonight, but Keith had asked for me to comment on this about the other acts. So there are these other acts that are in there, Acts of Peter, Acts of Thomas. It's like, oh, and then let me tell you more of the adventures of the apostles, right? Now, what's interesting is when one version of, I think it's the act of Thomas, one version doesn't have the hymn to the pearl in it at all, and yet it's independent. But then there's another version that has the hymn to the pearl inserted into the act somewhere in the narrative, right? And so what that suggests is that, and I think scholars agree that hymn to the pearl is an older document that someone just thought, it'd be great to just plug this right into the narrative right here. And so they do that. But this great myth of self-discovery, of discovering the inner light within oneself and having that put right into the narrative. So I wish I knew more about the hymn to the pearl, but I'm not as familiar with it as I am with some of these other texts. So I hope that sort of answers the question.
Well, the reason I think about it is David Dillon again, because took a couple courses from him at CIIS. And he said that one of the things about the hymn of the pearl that's unusual is that the secret that everybody is seeking is right in the center of the material world and surrounded by a dragon. And either a single child or a boy and girl are sent from a basically pure realm by the gods. They send their children down to get this pearl, but when they get to Egypt, where the pearl is, they forget who they are. That kind of Gnostic, we knew, but now what? We don't know. And an eagle is sent to wake them up. And the eagle has a scroll in its claws, that's got the word, this is who you really are, remember. And I've seen that same thing like in, what was the Touched by an Angel? Exact same thing they built in. That in the midst of the worst of it is where the secret is hidden. As opposed to just reject the whole world. It's like, no, buried in the center of it is the pearl.
Yeah.
And that's a different kind of flavor than Gnosticism that hates the world.
Yes, that's a great idea. I'm really glad that you know about that, and I appreciate that. Yeah, I think that's a great example of instead of rejecting the world, or even when the world is getting really terrible, that there's knowledge to be found in the shitstorm, I suppose, right? And so you have to sometimes dive. You have to get dirty sometimes in order to find it. Any other questions or thoughts? So I thought I would then just read just a few, so it's not just me going through this, just picking a few different texts. So they're all, really, if if there's one book that I'd recommend, the Nag Hammadi text, the Nag Hammadi scriptures, as the current edition is called, I would highly recommend those of you who are interested in getting this text, this book in particular. So, the Gospel of Thomas. So the prologue, like I mentioned before, but it says, "These are the hidden sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Judas Thomas, the twin, recorded. And he said, 'Whoever discovers the interpretation of these sayings will not taste death.' Jesus said, 'Let one who seeks not stop seeking until one finds. One finds, one will be troubled. When one is troubled, one will marvel and will reign over all.'" So that's how the Gospel of Thomas begins. And those statements, as you can imagine, don't exist in the other Gospels that we might be a little bit more familiar with. But there are other statements, for example, do unto others you'd have them do unto you. A lot of the things that we're familiar with in the other Gospels are mentioned in the Gospel of Thomas. I do want to flip over to the Gospel of Philip because this is where things get kind of interesting. Oh, another thing I forgot to mention, looking at it here. Certain elements are really important in Gnostic thought in terms of ritual and sacraments. Water, salt, fire, air. These are things that are explicitly mentioned in the text. Also, viewing the divine as, instead of Father, Son, Holy Spirit, as Father, Mother, Child. I imagine some of the Thelemites in the room are like, that sounds really familiar. Born from chaos, or out of chaos, coming things into form, right? So these are just some things to mention. But I want to find where he mentions, so here is one of the references from the Gospel of Philip for the union in the bridal chamber. "If the female had not separated from the female and the male would not have died. The separation of male and female was the beginning of death. Christ came to heal the separation that was from the beginning and reunite the two in order to give life to those who died through separation and unite them. A woman is united with her husband in the bridal chamber, and those united in the bridal chamber will not be separated again. That is why Eve became separated from Adam, because she had not united with him in the bridal chamber." So that's one of the references to this thing called the bridal chamber. I want to find one other.
Have you shown that one to Corey?
No.
Do you know how he has this whole thing about how Jesus became transgender when he resurrected?
No, I was not familiar with that.
Man, we need to talk about this.
I should definitely. I thank you for that. See, it just everyone's on the same track.
That's why he calls him the lady. Them.
That's great. So another one that I wanted to mention is also the Gospel of Judas. This is just where things get really interesting here. So, and I should say, it's not just that he takes them aside and goes, "So I need a guy to betray me." That I think would be kind of boring as a gospel. Really, what it is he cracks Judas's psyche completely open. So not only does he set him aside and go, "So look, you have this special task," he's like, "And here's the reality of like all cosmic knowledge," right? So, for an example, it says here, when his disciples heard this, talking about this prayer of thanksgiving, saying, "I'm going to be leaving pretty soon," they were angry. They're pissed off. They began getting angry and hostile, blaspheming against him in their minds. And Jesus recognized they did not understand, and he said to them, "Why has your concern produced this hostility? Your God who is within you and has his powers have become angry with your souls. Let any of you who is a strong person bring forward the perfect human being and stand before my face." And they all said, "We are strong." But none of their spirits dared to stand before him except Judas Iscariot. He was able to stand before him, yet he could not look him in the eye, but turned his face away. Judas said to him, "I know who you are, and from what place you have come. You have come from the immortal realm of Barbelo." And I lost my place. "And I'm not worthy to pronounce the name of the one who has sent you." So then Jesus understood that Judas was contemplating things that are lofty, and he said to him, "Move away from the others." I'm going to take you aside. And I shall explain to you the mysteries of the kingdom. You can attain it, but you will go through a great deal of grief. For somebody else will take your place so the 12 disciples may be complete once again with their God. Judas said to him, when will you explain these things to me, and how will the great day of light dawn for the generation? But when he said these things, Jesus departed from him. So he then takes Judas aside, and Judas has this vision of these cosmic entities and the actual nature of the universe. But then, it says here at the very end that he betrays him, and how it ends is, now their high priest murmured because he had stepped into the guest room for his prayer. Some scholars were there watching closely in order to lay hold of him during the prayer, for they were afraid of the people, since he was regarded by them all as a prophet. And they came over to Judas and said to him, what are you doing in this place? You are Jesus' disciple. He answered them in accordance with their wish, and Judas received some money and handed him over to them. So it ends with the actual betrayal. But before that, he's like, no, this is my mission. This is my mission. This is what I'm supposed to be doing. Any other questions or thoughts on any of this stuff?
I kind of feel that, with Orthodox Christianity, there's a very specific way that it's practiced. There's different, traditions, but there's a set of books, right? But with Gnosticism, it seems like an individual has a choice of, depending on where they came through from, if they were Roman or if they were, Greco-Roman, they would have been studying certain references, as opposed if they may have came from a different area and sort of discovered Gnosticism, Christianity, and blended that in, right?
Yeah.
I feel that with Gnosticism, it continued to evolve, and it's sort of like the living tradition of Christianity, like almost on the opposite end of the polarity, I guess, opposite end of the spectrum, in regards to how there's orthodoxy and then there's the living tradition. I do have one question though. Can you maybe explain on like some of these like other entities, like the demiurge, like Abraxas, or the archons, or a lot of this sort of cosmology and of Gnosticism?
Yeah, so that's the interesting thing, is that with the different texts, they're not consistent about this either. How many are there? What are their names? What are their functions? It seems that the Father, or the one that is unknowable, has its own set of entities that are tasked with going in and representing, the positive aspects of reality or the psyche, and that the demiurge has his own crew of entities that are meant to help him with corruption and violence and death. But the thing about it is that they're not consistent, but that they all come from the same source, the Pleroma, which is, again, from the Jungian perspective, is the collective unconscious. So all of these entities have a source. They all have a source, and yet they are differentiated by their function and what their purpose is in relationship to humanity. So whether it's meant to enslave humanity, corrupt humanity, or liberate humanity, or give wisdom to humanity, those are things that, that's how they are at variance with each other. But their origin is all from the same place. And there are places in some of the Gnostic texts that say that the Pleroma is within each individual person. And that's a pretty profound thing to think about, because that would mean that the fullness of the complexity of all of these things is in every single one of us. But no pressure or anything about dealing with that. Right. But that's something else. And again, it's not super consistent. Sometimes the Pleroma is depicted as being totally transcendent, and at times it is parallel to the things that are going on inside individual people. So that's how I would try to answer it. But I think some of the texts go into greater detail, and others just sort of mention that there are these powers in a more abstract way.
Yeah, okay. That makes sense.
Yeah. All right. Any other thoughts or questions or anything? Good? Okay. Well, I think that's all I have to say. I think in closing, one thing that I think is to keep in mind in terms of contemporary Gnosticism, jumping off of actually what you said, is I would agree that a mark of contemporary Gnosticism is this willingness to take knowledge from a variety of sources. this is what I think where I would take a plug for Thelema in particular is the notion that you can see wisdom in all these different traditions. You can see all these practices as being these great tools for the individual and for a community. And instead of saying, well, let's just drop kick this, it really is this eclectic attitude that is pretty unique, instead of saying that we need to ignore areas of knowledge, or because someone tells you not to read a book, that you're not going to read it. So I do think that many of us in the room here, regardless of how we might identify, I think in our own way, are heirs to the Gnostic lineage, in that we are seeking illumination and doing it by reading as much as we can and practicing these various practices and keeping that open mind. And that really is the critical thing, is the openness of one's mind, as opposed to keeping it closed and in a state of ignorance, as the Gnostics would say. So I thank you again all for coming tonight, and I hope this was helpful, at least to give you a little bit of an introduction. And really, I mean, the best way to study the Gnostics is just to read their works. And I remind myself when I read the Nag Hammadi text that if it wasn't for that accident out in the desert, we wouldn't even be having this conversation tonight. So it's a humbling thing to know that by a chance encounter that we suddenly have this historical information. So thank you again very much.